Does it look good?
Dude, your focus was on
Hey,
Sanders.
what's up, Sharks? I'm here in the third period with Helen and Taka and Thomas and Jess X and Ling and Sean Fu. Welcome to your last Sanders lecture of the year. Today I'm going to go over the main points of what you read in the Paul Krugman AP Economics textbook. I'm going to try to simplify things. I don't think the reading was that hard, but I'm going to talk about some concepts that absolutely need to be addressed in your quarter four exam, whether you're doing a voiceover for a PowerPoint, whether you're doing an infographic, or whether you're writing the 600-word plus essay. So let's go ahead and get started. I'm going to base everything on these three questions, just in case everything's coming out fuzzy in the video. The first question is, why fix an economy? The second question is, how do you permanently fix an economy? And then the third question is, what can states do? I'll end with that third question, and that third question will directly tie into some concepts that you have to bring into your quarter four exam. I'm going to speak in generalities, but when you offer an economic solution, I'm going to stop looking at the camera. When you offer an economic solution, they need to be specific to your country. So the one thing that I'm going to warn you all of, Helen, is don't repeat this lecture and think I'm going to give you full credit. I'm speaking in the broadest terms possible, then you need to narrow it down based on the resources that your chosen global south country has. All right, so let's go ahead and get started. The first question is, why should you fix an economy? It's kind of a silly question. There is a way to answer this where you would bring in one of the vocabulary terms. So let me throw it out on the table. Guys, why is it worth fixing a broken economy?
Improves GDP.
Okay, it improves GDP. Improving GDP is kind of like the same thing. So why fix an economy is like saying, why improve GDP?
Increases the population's lifetime.
Say it again.
It makes people live better.
Okay, right. So Thomas says it makes people live better. The vocabulary term associated with that, Jess, you have the best shot at this.
Living conditions.
Yeah, there's something else, but you're super duper close. Anybody remember? It's not living conditions, it's...
Human above.
Okay, so you're talking about HDI, and that's pretty fancy, a little fancier than I want you to go. So Thomas says you want to make people happy, and that's true. Jess said, hey, you want to improve their living conditions, also correct. The term is standard of living. So why do you want to fix them? Yeah, economics has a lot of terms. Behind those fancy terms, not that this is a fancy term, but behind those terms are really simple ideas. Why do you want to fix an economy? Because you want everybody, and I'm emphasizing everybody within a state to have a higher standard of living. And we kind of have that responsibility to one another. It starts in our communities, expands to our countries, and then ideally, as global citizens, everyone, especially as citizens of the global north, we want to improve the standards of living of the global south. Okay, so here we go. Why do you fix an economy? So we're all about improving the standard of living. Your quarter four exam, stated another way, is all based on figuring out why the standard of living of your country right now is low, and what could the country do, what could the government of your country do to improve that standard of living. So I'm not going to answer that question yet. Let's go to question number two. So how do you permanently fix an economy? There's three simple answers to that question. Let's see if anyone in this classroom read. What? Jess, just one, because I know you're an economics expert. I'll tell you what, let me make it a little bit trickier for you since you have special knowledge in economics at this point. Yeah, a little bit. There's three answers to this question, but they're not all equal. What is the least important answer to the question, how do you fix an economy?
Physical capital?
Correct. Sorry, I paused on that. All right, so how do you fix an economy? You make the economy more productive? How do you make the economy more productive? You make the workers more productive. How do you make workers more productive? How do you increase productivity? Answer number one. Jess said you improve or expand or increase physical capital. When you talk about physical capital, you're saying one of two things. Number one, you're giving the people tools with which to work. Number two, you're giving them, no, hold on to that. That's a separate concept. But when you talk about physical capital, and don't, see if you can do it from memory. I think it'll make it easier to write. When you talk about physical capital, you're talking about giving them tools. You're also talking about giving them something else that is not a tool. It's a problem actually that China has to contend with because it's overpopulated. Knowledge is an excellent answer, but it's not physical capital.
Technology.
Give the
We'll get to it.
more babies.
We'll actually talk about more babies in a moment. All right, so when you talk about physical capital, you're talking about two things. Giving the workers tools will make them more productive. Second is giving them space. And here's the problem. If you go into a lot of Chinese factories, and in particular China and India, because they have such huge populations, workers don't have enough space with which to operate. They are confined physically. That slows them down. One of the advantages that the United States has is our population is like 1/4 of that of China's. So the American worker, he's got tools and he's got a lot of space. So the American worker is one of the most productive on earth. The reason that this matters for you guys is because one of the problems that you probably will not have is overpopulation in your countries. Probably. I could be wrong in some cases, but I think I'm going to be right in most cases. So while the workers of your chosen country may not have tools, they will have space, physical space with which to work. Okay, that is the least important thing you can do to fix an economy. They've done all kinds of economic studies. That's been established. What's second on the list? Thomas, you've already said it, so let's say it again.
More babies.
No,
Oh,
what's wrong with you?
Education.
God, you're in a school.
Human capital.
The answer is not sex, Thomas,
Human capital.
to any of life's problems. All right, I'm pulling around. All right, so the second thing is, whoa. The worst drawing of a book ever. All right, so the second thing is you want to educate your populace. That is the simple concept. The fancy economic term is human capital. Human capital is you want to teach your population to read and to do math. There is a direct correlation between the quality and level of education, and you can even go simpler than that. Every country that I know of has a law in place where you have to get X amount of years of education. In some in some poor countries, it'll be like 2nd grade. In other countries, it'll be 6th grade. In some countries, you have to go all the way to the 10th grade. In the United States, you have to go until you're your age. You can drop out of high school, but not until your sophomore year. That's really important because they've shown a direct correlation. Economic studies have shown a direct correlation between the number of years of education and the productivity of an economy. So there you go, human capital. It's why all of you guys are in school right now, by the way, so that you can be productive, contributing members to the labor force. Okay, physical capital, human capital, and then the third and by far the most important factor that improves the productivity of an economy, the best way to fix an economy is what, Helen? All right, so technology is the most important. I'm going to ham it up a little bit. I've drawn my version of R2-D2 from Star Wars. So technology is obviously a broad term. It can encompass a lot of things. It does not need to encompass robots, but someday it absolutely will. Technology is the single strongest motivator, instigator of a strong economy. South Korea, Singapore, Eastern China, Japan are all really great examples of countries that invested heavily in technology in terms of communication through 5G networks, through 4G networks, and transportation through public transportation. You invest in the highest level of technology, and chances are the result of it will be a better economy. All right, there it is. On your exam, you're going to talk about how to improve physical capital, how to improve human capital, how to improve technology. Simple enough, these aren't hard ideas. I think maybe the challenge for you will be to be specific. Okay, I can be a little bit more specific than that, but before I do, let's bring it back, and sure enough, just to keep Thomas happy, we will talk about sex. So at one point, months and months and months ago, it feels like another lifetime, I told you about the production possibilities frontier. If you draw a PPC graph, also production possibilities curve, and you put capital goods and consumer goods on the y-axis and the x-axis, capital goods being tools, consumer goods being final goods. So if you think of it in a simple term, an example of a consumer good would be a cheeseburger. The example of a capital good would be the oven that makes that cheeseburger. So these are the tools that make consumer goods, and these are the things that get sold to consumers. The curve here shows a country's productivity. If they utilized their entire labor force, their human capital, their physical capital, and their technology, the idea is that this hypothetical country right here cannot produce beyond production possibilities curve. So this line, therefore, represents their potential GDP. But for a country to improve itself, the idea is you need to push this line out. How do you push the line out? And by the way, those of you who take AP economics, what I'm about to say, I can almost guarantee with certainty will be the free response question. How do you improve the long run aggregate supply of a country? How do you attain sustainable economic growth? Or the question will be, how do you push the PPC out? The answer on the exam will be physical capital, human capital, or technology. Improve any or all of those three things, and it will improve a country's productivity. Okay, I promised to talk about sex, so let's do it. There are two things beyond physical capital, human capital, and technology that will push it out. Population growth and newly discovered natural resources. So if people start doing the hippity-dippity a lot and the population booms, you have more workers, this will be more productive. If all of a sudden you find petroleum in your country and you have this new source of revenue, it will lead to greater productivity. Here's the problem though. Here's why sex, oh, by the way, immigration also works too.
I think I know the problem. It's the real GDP declined because the amount of people.
All right, so Thomas is in a class called AP Human Geography. I love AP Human Geography partly because Dylan took the class and he loved it so much that he kept coming home and talking about it. There's a guy that you learn about in AP Human Geography called Malthus. Malthus said, life is always going to suck. Because as we come up with new inventions and new ways to improve the standard of living, because population will always increase as a result, like we'll have an improvement and then people have a lot more babies and then life will suck again and we'll always be on the edge of starvation. His name is Malthus. It's the Malthusian dilemma, and it's been proven false. It was true when he wrote it in the 19th century. He wrote it just before the Second Industrial Revolution, so there were a lot of things that he didn't factor into it. It's been proven false. Some people still believe it, but for the most part, economists have rejected it. That said, the problem with letting immigrants in or hoping to find some new valuable natural resource or doing the hippity-dippity so that there's a population boom, is it increases productivity of a country for a short amount of time. I'll give you an example. During World War II, and this is an example from your textbook, during World War II, out of necessity, America invited women to work in the factories. By the way, they did a fantastic job. It turned out that women are equal to men in a industrial setting and probably in all settings. I think definitely in all settings. The issue is, it goes out. So all of a sudden, let's say, you let the women in your country work, or you let 10-year-olds work. You could do that. You can use child labor. It's a terrible choice, but you could do it. It bumps it out for a year. And then the next year, you don't have sustainable growth. It's the same thing with a natural resource, because whatever the natural resource is, with a few exceptions, you're going to use it up. So it'll bump this out, but then it won't keep growing. But if you improve human capital, physical capital, and technology, the line can keep going out forever if you consistently invest in those three things. Sex, sadly, is only a temporary solution. Okay, we move on. So we're talking about pushing the PPC out. Your job is to come up with what your countries could do. I'm going to throw this question at the class right now, and then we'll go over. I'm just going to highlight what the textbook said. So guys, if you would, I'm probably going to pause the video right now. Talk to each other. 60 seconds. What can a government do to improve technology, physical capital, and human capital? I'll give you a couple minutes, talk about it, and we'll come back. Try to come one for each. Okay, so I just asked the class to come up with examples of what a government can do to improve technology, human capital, physical capital. We'll start with the most important, and I really want to stress this. If you want to improve a country's economy, whether it's global south, global north, it doesn't matter, you should focus on technology first. Lane, how can a government improve a country's technology? So Ling said education, which is the absolute correct answer for human capital. I'm going to ask you to be a little bit more specific, but keep that idea in the back of your head. Specifically, technology. And there was something in the textbook about this. There's a term that you should be walking around with. Does anybody know what it is? It's actually 2 letters. Thomas is cheating, by the way. You can't see him, but I can.
2 letters?
It's 2 letters. You may not know it now, but those of you who go into engineering at university will become very familiar with it because a lot of it comes from universities, not just the US, anywhere. Do 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 do. Okay. Governments can help with technology, but it's a tricky business. Ideally, you want free market capitalism because capitalism has shown that it will grow an economy faster. That's kind of why the communist experiment failed. So you want free market capitalism, which means you don't want the government intervening too much in the economy because they'll mess it up. Because a government is not a business. It's not seeking profit. So you've got to be careful because you don't want the government selling stuff. You don't want the government selling cell phones, for example. So you don't want them inventing. You don't want them manufacturing. But where they can help is with the scientific principles that underlie the new inventions. So engineers take the ideas from scientists and they turn it into usable products. That is the difference between a scientist and an engineer. The scientist finds the theories that provide the principles that engineers translate into usable technology. So what can a government do? Not invest in the engineers per se, but invest in the scientists. What do we call that?
Research.
There it is.
Research and
Development.
development.
Okay, so everybody actually does call it R&D. R&D is a real popular term. Now that I've said it, you'll see it everywhere, and you're like, oh wow, I've never noticed that before. So research and development is a really big thing. You'll hear about like research universities, for example. When you apply to college your senior year, you will certainly be applying to research universities. So research universities often get their money to do their scientific experiments from governments, because it's the government investing in improving the productivity of the economy without actually investing in companies themselves, because that creates a conflict. You can't have the government as a business, unless you're Donald Trump. Anyway, story for another day. But you can do this, and it has nothing but positive consequences. Invest in your scientists, invest in your research, invest in your universities, invest in the research process. Okay, human capital. So there's two parts of this if we only draw from the textbook. Ling already said one, she said education, right. So if a government invests in education, that improves the human capital. Let's get a little bit more specific than that. What kind of education?
Provide public free
Yeah, okay.
education.
You want free education, so public education like Thomas just said. You want it universal. Open to boys, open to girls, open to any race, any religion, whatever you got. If you have a citizen in your country and they are a child, you give them an education, free, public, universal, quality, and over many years. The ideal scenario would be to keep children in school to at least 16 years old, and if you could go beyond that, better. And if you could go so far as to create free university education, ACEs, then you've got a really sweet scenario. You'll find a lot of the socialist governments in Europe actually have nearly free university education. It doesn't mean that everybody gets a university education, but when they take a test that's as stressful as the Gaokao for the different countries, if they do well in it, they get to a university and they don't have to pay for it, except for like books and like minor things like that. Hugely beneficial for an economy. Okay, the second one is less obvious than education. The textbook talked about it. You guys probably didn't notice because you probably weren't that convinced by the argument, but there is another thing that adds to human capital. Anybody know what it is? Yeah. I am punished for my lack of faith. If people are healthy, if people know that they're cared for, they'll be more productive. You are improving the quality of your human capital.
Free insurance.
Mm. Yeah, this is actually something, by the way, that my country does very poorly. We have a poor public health system. We have an excellent private health system, but a poor public health system. Okay, now let's talk about the last one, the least important, physical capital. The book focuses on one thing in particular. Anybody remember what it is? Something that China has invested in incredibly over the last 20, 30 years. All right, transportation, communication, sewage systems, power lines, all of these things that help a city and a country, links them together, is known under a broad umbrella term, which is, yeah, okay, excellent.
No.
I can almost guarantee you that whatever global south country that you've chosen has terrible infrastructure. It tends to be a universal characteristic of less economically developed countries, is they just have awful, awful infrastructure, from communication, from access to the internet, things like that, to highways, to a lack of railroads, to poor airports, to bad ports as well. It also impedes shipping. This is how a government fixes an economy. These are very broad ideas. Don't just say my country needs to provide public education. I want you to be more specific, and that's where your research comes in. But the answer to the question, how can you improve your global south economically? Merry Christmas. This is the answer according to Paul Krugman and the AP Economics textbook. Okay, we're going to take a look at Gapminder right now, chapter 3. All right.